wired network. So it's a good idea to capture usage information of what's happening on the wired network. And what I'm talking about here is how the users are accessing the wired network from their desktop, from their wired devices. I'm not talking about traffic in the core of the wired network. And the reason is that users that are using the wired network also do very similar things in the wireless network, and it can help expose things that you may not be thinking about that will surprise you once you actually get out there and have deployed the network. And so, for instance, look at the video and voice traffic, which would be your UDP traffic as opposed to your data TCP traffic. Talk to your customers about how they roam around the building. Are they expected to roam between different floors? Do the same users roam between the warehouse and the office environment? How are they using IP phones, wireless IP phones, as they move around in these areas? Talk to them about the number of users that they would expect on an access point. What do they think their maximum number might be at peak times? Often, for instance, some businesses will bring in seasonal staff, and you can get a very high loading on your access points for very short periods of time. So talk to them about the average and the maximum number of users. Talk to them also about the users not only on an access point but in the area as well, and where those users might be located in the building. We come down a little bit. It's very important now to capture what types of devices that the customer has. They may have PCs and tablets and handheld mobile devices like phones. They may use IP phones. They may have handheld scanners and barcode readers. They may be using security wireless cameras. So check on all of those different devices, because that's going to tell you what kind of coverage that you're going to need and what kind of services you're expected to provide. It's a really good idea to capture the model and the manufacturer of those wireless devices as well. And the reason is that you're going to be looking at the specifications of those devices, because you'll want to look at the receiver sensitivity of those devices in order to determine where is the edge of your cell when you're doing your site survey. And what you really want to do is try and work out what is the device that has the lowest receiver sensitivity and transmits at the lowest power level, because that's your worst case scenario of the type of device that you need to support on that wireless LAN. And then you want to talk to them about what kind of applications and uses that they have on the network. And you may say, well, isn't this a bit of a duplication to what we looked at before? In some ways it is, but again, by asking the question in lots of different ways, you can uncover things that the customer may not think about telling you. So ask them, hey, what do you do on the network, and what do you expect to happen on the wireless network? And they'll say things like, I want to surf the web wherever I am. I want to be able to make voice calls. I want to actually support asset tagging, but only in these areas. And so ask them those kind of questions. And then the type of users. They may have trusted third parties coming on site, or they may just have visitors that really shouldn't be trusted. And this will give you an indication for the types of VLAN supports that you might need, the type of security authentication protocols that you might need to support. The last one is the special aesthetic needs. Oh my goodness. Customers always a surprise when you put up the access points and then they go, well, I didn't quite expect it to look like that. Is kind of ugly, or is kind of intrusive, or is kind of going to be a problem because, I have equipment that comes through here and, it could get knocked, or I really need people not to be able to see it. So there's lots of different things that could happen to you, and you need to ask them ahead of time. How do they feel? Show them what access points look like. Explain to them how it's going to be deployed, and then get their opinions and thoughts as to whether they need this equipment hidden or not exposed in some way. This is another one that will really help your installer. So the person's going to take your plan and actually execute it. And so capture as much information as you can about how this is going to be interconnected to the wired network. Now, as well as looking at the coverage, we want to look at some of the capacity issues as well. So it's time to start thinking about simultaneous uses that will be on that system and the different types of uses, the different types of devices. And again, what you're trying to do here is capture information that can help you decide what kind of density of wireless LANs that you need in different areas around the building. So really try to capture this and to try and dig down as to what the customer expectations are. And again, we're building on some of the earlier questions here as well. Here you can see the rooms where users are using. I did a deployment once where ever so often they would put all the users in a cafeteria area to host a big business meeting, or everybody would congregate in the conference room in order to do troubleshooting. And during those times, the Wi-Fi usage would go through the roof. And so they brought me back in because there were specific problems that we hadn't identified right up front, and we needed to put a much denser deployment of access points in those specific areas. So always ask those questions as well. And lastly, even though on the Cisco certification exam, it does not list a need to look at security survey requirements, it's always a good idea to capture information about what kind of security mechanisms are the customers expecting to use. And often they will use the existing security mechanisms and they're not deploying anything new from the wireless perspective. They really want to extend what they've currently got. So you might see that they've got a radius or diameter server for their authentication, or they may be using a Microsoft Windows Active Directory server. So capture that information. Talk to them about what type of authentication that they want to use over the wireless. Some people may say, no, I want it completely open. It's a hotel environment. I'll leave it completely open. Some may want to use a portal type of authentication where they connect to a browser and enter perhaps a key or even a credit card. You know, always try and steer them from using the WEP protocol because it's not secure, but there may be some reasons that they want to use the WEP protocol. I had a deployment recently where I needed to get Server 2008 working, and it was a lab environment, and so I haven't really got any business data on there. I just wanted to run a few tests and then bring down my lab. And Server 2003 was defined before 802.11i specifications, so I needed to use the WEP protocol. So you may find it occasionally out there, but really steer them towards WPA2 if you're dealing with a new enterprise business environment. And even a consumer environment should be moving towards WPA2. Whether they need to deploy 802.1x, then they may need to deploy many of these. They might be doing Portal in some areas and 802.11.1x in others. So you may get multiple answers here. And then again, capture if they've got any back-end user databases. I mentioned the Microsoft Active Directory for authentication, but there may be other back-end user type of databases that you'll want to use as well. So capture as much as you can because it will really help your installer get this network up and working successfully for their customer. So that concludes this look at this particular site survey, and I really hope you find this form useful. And again, when you're looking at your deployments, feel free to add additional forms because you may find some interesting opportunities. And again, this form was very much focused on the internal deployment. You'd need to tweak it quite a bit to get it to work for an outdoor deployment. So a few terms you should be familiar with. The building blueprint. This is the technical drawing of the building itself. It's a very, very valuable resource if you can get hold of it. Shows you where the electrical outlets are. It shows you the wall construction. Just be aware that sometimes people will add walls or remove walls or change things, and they don't always update the blueprints. So check to make sure they're still accurate when you get out on site. The site layout, this is a plan of what the actual layout of the floor is. So it'll include things like cubicles, where perhaps the warehouse shelving is, where conference rooms are, where the manufacturing equipment is set up. Multipath distortion. So remember we talked about hospitals and manufacturing and how it's very metallic and you've got a lot of reflected signals. Well, those reflected signals, when they arrive at the receiver, you've literally got signals coming from different directions. We call that multipath. And that multipath would distort each other. So it's multipath distortion. That's the effect that you're trying to overcome when you're deploying in things like manufacturing environments, etc., when you have those very strong reflected paths. Roaming. I mentioned roaming a couple of times. Roaming is when I move between access points. So let's say I'm making a voice call on my IP phone and I'm on access point 1 and I move to access point 2. We consider that movement to be roaming, and the system needs to make sure I don't lose my connection when I go between those access points. So here's one of my favorite resources. It's a fairly light read, and it talks and explains what multipath is, and it explains by what does Cisco mean when they talk about diversity at the antenna. And so it's really a nice little document. It even has a little case study on a golf course. But I really recommend you read this one, because if you understand a little bit about multipath and what happens to your signal when it goes over the air, it will really help you understand how to do a site survey and meet those customer requirements. So what did we cover in this course? Well, we talked about the fact that every site is unique. And that is both the physical layout, but also the RF environment. So just because someone tells you every floor is the same, it's not. Something will be different. A filing cabinet will be moved. People will congregate in different ways. Some will put a metallic flower pot on their desk. Something will change and have a strange impact. So you always need to do a site survey. We also talked about how unique customer requirements are, and we touched on several different areas. We talked about looking at how are they planning to use the system, what applications go across the network, what kind of devices do they have, what kind of special implementation requirements do they have. Do they need to hide the access point? Do I need to lower it because of the high ceilings? So every customer has some unique requirements. Really important to ask the right questions to understand this so that your site survey will actually meet those customer needs. We then talked about the vertical markets, and we went through hospital, manufacturing, schools and warehouse locations, very unusual situations, and knowing what the site is beforehand really helps you be a little bit more prepared, and over time you'll get more experience and more familiar with these different environments. But when you do your first one, these can be quite challenging environments to work in. We then went through a demonstration of the form that you can use to give to your customer to fill in prior to you going out on your site visit.